You've blamed society. You don't have an answer. So it must be a conspiracy. There must be some sort, and you're just asking questions. You don't know, right? This is the game that is played by so many corrupt commentators, just asking questions. I don't have to show you evidence that something terrible is happening. I don't have to actually demonstrate how the thing is happening. I don't have to tell you who the problem is. Wink, wink. But I can just tell you right now that there is a problem. But even, and if I'm asked about it, hey, I'm just asking questions. Now, let me tell you something about just asking questions for a second. Just asking questions is a game for children. My son is 7. He can just ask questions. My daughter is 10. She can just ask questions. If you are 50 and you are just asking questions, I don't think you're just asking questions. I think that your level of curiosity is actually quite low. I think that you don't care enough to know or know enough to care. I think that the vast majority of people who are in the just asking questions business have an answer that they want to suggest, but they know there's no evidence for it, so instead they hide behind just asking questions. In other words, they're completely full of shit.
I find it fascinating that many conservatives are now lambasting Tucker Carlson for asking certain hard questions about narratives we've been fed by the government. Do I agree with Tucker on all of his views? Of course not. I don't agree with anybody on 100% of their views. That would be a weird thing to do. But I also think it's a weird thing to do to lambast somebody for questioning certain narratives when, in fact, that's what it means to be a skeptical citizen of a truly democratic nation.
All right, guys, so we got to talk about the current political transformation that is happening in this country on both sides of the aisle. But in this video, I'm going to address what's happening on the right side of the political aisle as the conservative movement / Republican Party is evolving from the old school Reaganism, neoconservatism that was once very popular in the party as early as the early 2000s, okay, very prevalent. And now it is the America First Trumpism that is dominant in the party. Now, the main difference between the two ideologies is not necessarily when it comes to domestic policy. I think both sides of the aisle generally agree when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to protecting our borders, when it comes to law and order. I think where the main differences show up is when you start talking about foreign policy, mainly when you talk about things like free trade or fair trade, and especially when you talk about foreign aid and wars, okay? Because that's where the big difference comes in, okay? And we got to talk about that today as, again, that is causing a huge rift in the movement. There's a huge debate going on between two individuals that are prominent within the movement that I believe represent both sides of the spectrum when it comes to what's going on in conservative politics. You have Ben Shapiro, who I think represents the old school Reaganism, neoconservative worldview that is totally fine with America interventionism overseas, mainly when it comes to foreign aid and spending money to fight wars in order to maintain America's corporate multinational dominance in the military-industrial complex. He's totally fine with that. He's totally okay with that because he believes that fundamentally America is a force for good, and everything that we do in the world when it comes to foreign policy, for the most part, is advancing good in the world because American leadership in the world is good, especially for countries like Israel that Ben Shapiro seems to be extremely concerned about.
I mean, I think that every Jew throughout world history who has a brain and knows history has always wondered if a country that is not a Jewish state is going to eternally provide them security guarantees and full citizenship, of course. I mean, that's I think to think that that's why the existence of the state of Israel is the single greatest guarantor of my loyalty to the United States, frankly.
Okay, I believe that is a good summary of his position. And then you have Tucker, who I think represents the America First / kind of Trumpism worldview, where it's like, hey, you know what? We need to take care of ourselves, okay? We don't need to be involved in everybody else's business. We do not need to be giving out aid to all these foreign countries when we have problems here in the United States of America. Let's put Americans first and let the world take care of themselves, okay? We are not in a position to solve everybody's problems when we can't even solve our own problems. So again, of course, these ideologies have clashed because, again, Tucker has come out here and started asking questions, right? Asking questions about our core beliefs in regards to America's role in the world and whether or not America is actually representative of the greater good.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis did.
I love that. How'd that work? that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like, it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no? How about like spending all of your effort to prevent this from happening? Would you kill baby Hitler, famously?
Right.
So I don't know why we're sitting back and allowing this to happen if we really believe it will extinguish the human race or enslave the human race. Like, how can that be good?
Yeah, so you see now you heard that, okay? Now, Tucker's comment sparked a lot of debate online, and Ben Shapiro took issue with Tucker's comments as he's been taking issue with Tucker Carlson quite a bit lately, mainly because of Tucker's skepticism of Israel and their actions in Gaza and whether or not the United States should be involved and whether or not we should be supporting Israel, and asking questions about that in order to challenge the narrative that, again, we have to be involved in every conflict. Now, again, clearly and obviously, people like Ben Shapiro see that as a threat because, he believes that it's in the United States' best interest to protect foreign countries like Israel no matter what. And that's why I find it to be fascinating that Ben Shapiro took the opportunity to criticize Tucker for once again asking questions about the atomic bomb and whether or not it was actually necessary for us to drop a nuclear weapon on civilians during World War II. In which, again, Ben Shapiro takes issue with Tucker asking questions about America's foreign policy and the morality of our foreign policy. Take a look.
There is a theory that has now risen on the right that there is something deeply malign about the United States, something deeply wrong with the United States. This was made apparent over the weekend. Tucker Carlson was on Joe Rogan's show. Obviously, I'm very friendly with Joe. I think Joe does a great job during his interviews. And there was a clip from this interview that went particularly viral. This is a clip in which Tucker Carlson calls the United States evil for having dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, ending World War II, and then suggests that anyone who would justify that is also evil, which is a very traditionally left-wing perspective. It is not traditionally a particularly right-wing perspective because most people on the conservative side of the aisle tend to believe that America is a force for good in the world. And as we'll discuss, it turns out that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was necessary for ending World War II and likely saved millions of lives, both American and Japanese. So when it comes to the moral calculus of leaders killing people, that's the realm of normal politics. So for example, he will downplay Vladimir Putin's evil in killing his political opponents and invading sovereign countries and killing civilian populations in those sovereign countries by basically saying all leaders kill people. But when it comes to ending World War II by dropping the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which did bring an end to the war, that is a moral stain, a moral blight that America simply has been corrupted by. So here he was talking about Vladimir Putin killing people. Again, this is just a couple of months ago.
You should challenge some ideas. For instance, you didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny, about assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively,
Yes, this
because
is my
those
question.
are covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following: that every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry. That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader.
Because that's very blasé about leaders killing people. But when it comes to ending World War II, then all of a sudden the United States bears the stain of a giant blood guilt that can never be alleviated. Or if it can be, he has not really spelled out. So this isn't actually America First, ironically. This is actually kind of fascinating. It's something else. So the America First movement, right, which is the isolationist movement that was very well trafficked and very popular in 1939, 1940, before it took a late turn into overt anti-Semitism. He's saying that America is and has historically been a nefarious force in foreign policy, which is actually a left-wing argument from the 1960s, that America bears blood guilt. In fact, it sounds a lot more like radical protesters on today's college campuses than like a traditional conservative. You hear that when Russell Brand says to him. It sounds like what you are saying about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is what the left is saying about the history of race in the United States, that America bears blood guilt, that America is in its essence guilty and corrupt and sinful. That's a very strange perspective, and it's not traditionally conservative. Just like, again, you can believe it, but it's not traditionally conservative. Tucker's narrative does have one important utility. It makes him the go-to source for everything. So to get back to his just asking questions, in this unfalsifiable world, right, where you can't trust anything, you can't believe what you see, you can't believe evidence provided because everybody's lying to you, and counter evidence is unnecessary because they hid all of it. This means the only person you can trust is the person who promulgates the reverse of any traditional narrative you've been hearing in America. It's a pure reaction against whatever is the story of the day. Whether it's true, whether it's false is irrelevant. It's just whatever is the story has to be false because I don't like the people who are telling the story. So they're hiding 9/11. And America's evil for Hiroshima. And Alex Jones is just as solid an informational source as anyone else, which is Tucker actually suggested he was prophetic on Joe Rogan's show. All our members of Congress, again, something that Tucker said on the show, every single one, effectively, are subject to blackmail by the intelligence agencies. According to Tucker, you have to believe Tucker. And if you don't, it's probably because you're part of the conspiracy or the cover-up, because you're owned, because you become the establishment, because you're weak and you can be taken over by nefarious forces. The only man of courage in this routine is apparently the truth seeker Tucker, who asks questions but doesn't actually examine the evidence on these particular issues, because why do you need to know things when you can just ask questions? And what's the point of trying to find things out when all the sources are themselves corrupted?
Yeah, so you're seeing that, you hear it out, okay? That is Ben Shapiro essentially saying that, hey, Tucker is not taking a traditionally conservative view. He's actually taking a more left-wing view on this subject of America's morality and whether or not America's actually a force for good in the world, and that Tucker is not actually asking questions in a way that is intellectually curious. Like, he doesn't actually really want the answers to the questions. He's not seeking the answers. He's simply asking questions as a way to discredit anybody that doesn't go along with the answers that he's essentially providing, which is that you can't trust anybody or you can't trust the evidence that is currently out there about certain narratives and certain things that we have been told to believe, okay? And it is interesting because now Vivek Ramaswamy has jumped into this debate and has essentially come to the side of Tucker and has taken a shot at Ben Shapiro for going after Tucker Carlson for asking questions. Take a look.
I find it fascinating that many conservatives are now lambasting Tucker Carlson for asking certain hard questions about narratives we've been fed by the government. Do I agree with Tucker on all of his views? Of course not. I don't agree with anybody on 100% of their views. That would be a weird thing to do. But I also think it's a weird thing to do to lambast somebody for questioning certain narratives when in fact that's what it means to be a skeptical citizen of a truly democratic nation. I'll tell you where it comes from, though. I'm not just going to tar somebody on the other side. Let's get to the heart of what's going on there. I think we as conservatives have appropriately been fed up by the self-loathing left that has repeatedly for 160 years and for the last 6 years incessantly questioned the founding of our country, obsessing over systemic racism and white rage and the original sin of slavery at our founding. And at a certain point, all of us, most conservatives I know, myself included, Tucker included, others, are saying enough with it already. Let's move forward as one country because we've beaten that dead horse to death. There's nothing more to say. Now, back in 1960, when you didn't have necessarily equal rights enjoyed across this country, that was still a relevant conversation to have, to say, well, slavery existed all the way through the Civil War. The Reconstruction era didn't quite put an end to those inequities. How are we going to deal with it in the Civil Rights Revolution? That was a reasonable discussion to have. But now we're 60 plus years after that, and at a certain point, it's time to move on. And if you're consistently still obsessing over narratives dating back over 250 years, then yes, that means you probably do in some measure hate this country. Fine. But that's different from saying that there are certain areas where we deserve to question our own history that haven't been questioned. And I think that that's the difference we need to draw. The distinction we need to draw is one thing to beat a dead horse and hate ourselves for the sake of hating ourselves. That's what the modern left does. But that's not what Tucker's doing. To the contrary, he's turning over rocks that haven't really been turned over, rolling over logs that deserve to be rolled over and seeing what crawls out. Sometimes maybe there's nothing there. Is he going to have a 100% hit rate? Of course not. But I don't think it's the right thing to do, especially as conservatives who are supposed to be skeptical of the government, to criticize somebody for asking questions And not just in a armchair way, but in a rigorous way, asking the kinds of questions that at least the American people deserve to have answers to and closure on. I think that's a good thing. And whether you're liberal or conservative, I think you actually do love this country if you're willing to ask those hard questions. And that's why I think it's a mistake, an unintentional mistake that many conservatives make when they try to tell people to shut up, sit down, and do as they're told. That's what the modern progressive left does. Let's not make the same mistake in return.
Yeah, I agree with Vivek 100%, right? And I'm not surprised that Vivek is the voice of reason in this little conflict between Tucker and Ben Shapiro, because Vivek, in my opinion, I think is more impressive than both of them, okay? To be quite honest with you. But personally, I think that, again, it's important to be able to ask questions about certain narratives, okay? And I don't care what the narrative is, I think it's important to ask questions about it, okay? I ask questions about the narrative of slavery all the time. The narrative that's fed to us is that, well, slavery is the white man's evil, okay? And that the white man is solely responsible for it, but they never talk about the role of the Africans in the Atlantic slave trade and how without the African tribes that were enslaving their own people and selling them to the Europeans, that it would not have been possible for slavery to become as prevalent as it was, okay? It would have been very hard for slavery to happen as it did without the help of the African kingdoms and the African tribes that were enslaving their own people. And they were doing very brutal things to their own people, okay? I think there are various arguments to challenge the narrative of slavery that I've made and I've received criticism for, but I think at the end of the day, it's important to have those type of intellectual exercises, right? And I think when it comes to this question about the morality of dropping the atomic bomb on Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, mostly places of civilian population, I think is a legitimate conversation to be had. Just like there's a legitimate conversation to be had about whether or not America should be supporting Israel when it comes to their actions in Gaza, okay? Because, again, you have civilians being killed. It is legitimate to ask questions about it, which is probably why Ben Shapiro takes so much issue with Tucker asking questions, because essentially this same kind of moral intellectual exercise that Tucker is doing is the same type of exercise that is being done when it comes to criticizing Israel for what they're doing in Gaza, even though I disagree with Tucker, right? I disagree in the sense that I personally do think that it was necessary to drop the bombs in the sense that if you want to increase the likelihood of saving American lives, right, then you do what you need to do. And I use the phrase increase the likelihood because, again, there's back and forth debate about whether or not we actually really needed to do it. Was Japan already ready to surrender, or were they going to fight to the death, right? Were they going to force the United States to invade their mainland in order to actually defeat them? Now, again, I personally go along with the narrative that, hey, you know, I think they were going to fight to the end. Maybe, just maybe, they would have eventually surrendered. But to be quite honest with you, when it comes to this issue of war, when you attack another country first, preemptively, the way that Japan attacked America, Pearl Harbor, you don't get to dictate how the war ends, right? You don't get to dictate whether or not your opponent annihilates your whole civilization, right? You just should be thankful if they don't do that, right? Because you attack them first, okay? And that has been the reality of war throughout all of history, okay? There are a lot of tribes and civilizations that don't exist anymore because they got in a war with another tribe or civilization and they were wiped out of existence. It is what it is. This is why I don't take the perspective that Tucker takes in regards to this idea that, you know, somehow, some way there has to be some morality when it comes to war, because there is no morality when it comes to war. Okay. Really, I think that most of world history and the history of civilizations can be summed up as the strong survive and the weak don't, for the most part. This is also why I don't agree with Ben Shapiro when it comes to this idea that America, by definition, is somehow a force for good. I'm not saying that America is a force for evil. I just think that, honestly, it's amoral. I think that foreign conflicts and geopolitics is amoral for the most part, because at the end of the day, all countries, I don't care if you claim to be a force for good or not, have to make immoral decisions for the survival of the country, right? You have to make decisions that are going to be morally questionable. So we're sitting here and we're trying to make a bunch of decisions about foreign policy, the survival of your own people based off morality. You're probably going to get wiped out. You're probably going to go extinct. And I could argue further that dropping nuclear weapons on Japan, for as bad as it was, probably saved us from having future nuclear conflicts, because we showed the world and Russia, which is probably part of the reason why we dropped the bomb as well too, is to show Russia that, hey, we'll actually use this on people, okay, and we'll use it on you too, right? If you F with us, right? I think that's actually the main reason we dropped it, to be quite honest with you. But yeah, the reason why we don't have more wars than we do is because of nuclear weapons. The fact that nuclear weapons exist has kept us from invading countries like Iran. It has kept us from invading countries like North Korea, because if a country gets a nuke, then they become U.S. invasion proof, right? So I actually could argue against Tucker and to say that, well, dropping the nukes in the long run probably saved more lives and made it less likely for America to get involved in wars with countries that have developed nukes. Because again, there's no doubt in my mind that if North Korea didn't have nukes, we would definitely have re-invaded North Korea to try to take out Kim Jong-un. There's no doubt in my mind. But I guess overall, my point is that I personally, when it comes to America's foreign policy, I understand the perspective of doing what you have to do to advance America's interest, right? My issue with that is when the politicians try to frame it as if we are morally superior to other people because of what we do, right? There's nothing moral about arming Islamic extremists in Afghanistan to fight Russians. There's nothing moral about that, right? We're just playing the geopolitical chess game, okay? And I understand that, but just don't lie to me about it, right? Don't lie to me and try to pretend like invading Iraq and toppling Saddam Hussein was somehow done because of some type of moral good, right? We were trying to advance some type of American morality in the world when we really weren't. We really don't give a damn about democracy, considering how we are allied with Saudi Arabia, okay? A very repressive regime, okay? They're very backwards by Western standards in regards to how they live, how they treat women, human rights. And when I say America, I don't mean the American people. I do think that the American people in general are a force for good in the world. What I'm talking about are the politicians, the decision makers, the elites, the people who are running the country, right, that are responsible for making these decisions. That is who I'm addressing, right? So I want to be clear about that. America has shown time and time again that the only consistency in regards to who we see as good and bad in the world has nothing to do with any of the things they tell us. Again, like human rights, democracy, freedom. They don't give a damn about that. What they actually give a damn about, does that leadership, does that country align with America's broader geopolitical interests? That's it. That's all they care about. You could be the most brutal dictator in the world, but if you align with America, if you're on our team, if you do what we want you to do, America's not going to do anything, right? You're going to be Gucci. You're going to be fine. It doesn't matter. So again, when you come out here and try to say that, well, you know, what we do from a geopolitical perspective is moral, or there's some type of morality to it, that's nonsense, right? So I actually don't agree with Ben Shapiro in the sense that America, by definition, is some greater good or some greater good force in the world. And I also don't agree with Tucker Carlson that our foreign policy decisions should be made on the basis of morality, especially when you're talking about war, right? I think it's actually more complicated and nuanced than that. So again, this is why I think that it's important to ask questions, right? That's why I think it's important to have these conversations and to not shut down these conversations by saying that, well, asking questions is bad, right? I don't think that asking questions is bad. I think having these types of intellectual exercises, having these types of debates is good for the conservative movement, okay? I don't want to be like the left where you can't question anything, or that you have to agree 99% with what everybody else thinks, or else, hey, you can't be a part of the movement. That's not good, right? It is actually good to question things and to have a different perspective on certain issues, especially, again, considering how we're all coming at it from the same angle of, hey, well, we think that this might be best for America. Maybe it's best for America not to nuke people, right? Maybe it's best for America to intervene in foreign conflicts where we are protecting people who have been invaded by some big, powerful foreign country like Russia, right? And this country is committing atrocities against innocent people. Then, yeah, I get that. I get how you can say, well, it's in America's best interest to protect those people or to show that, hey, we're going to stand up for these people in order to prevent a war from happening in the homeland, in the sense that you let a country get so big and powerful that they become a threat to the American people. I get that, right? But again, the debate, again, is centered around what is best for the American people. And I think a lot of times when you look at American foreign policy, what we do might be in the best interest of America's multinational corporate and military interests. But when it comes to the American people, it might not necessarily be in our interest, right? There's a difference between America, the corporation, okay, and the American people, right? And I think that's where the America First movement is coming from, in the sense that, we want to start doing things that are best for the American people from a foreign policy perspective, in the sense that we're not really isolationists as much as we're just, hey, let's not get involved in unnecessary wars. We should try to make as many friends as we can. We should have, trade agreements that benefit both parties, that benefit Americans, okay? And that's how we should conduct our foreign policy, okay? Through peaceful diplomacy. Now, again, in some cases, you may have to declare war, but we got to make sure that the war is in the best interest of the American people, not necessarily the best interest of the American corporation. That is essentially how most of our wars have been waged since World War II. It's not, okay, what's in the best interest of American people to protect Americans, which is, again, why we engaged in World War II, is to protect Americans. All the wars after that were basically about, okay, well, hey, how can we feed the military-industrial complex and to push America's multinational corporate interests? And I think that's what people really have a problem with. So that's my opinion on it. This is why it's important to be able to ask questions, right? That's my point, right? The whole point is that you should be able to ask questions in order to have these types of conversations, because these types of conversations are good. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.